I'm really looking forward to our presentation today by Anisha Gade and Sue Mark. But before I introduce them, I want to give us our word of the day. And today that is narration. And of course we've been talking about narrative all semester. We've been talking about two-dimensional representations of space as narratives, maps as narratives, as things that make arguments. We've talked about narratives as represented in murals. And of course when we had Harsha Ram, who was talking about how narratives in textual literature help us understand cities. We've also thought about the linear nature of certain kinds of being and walking through a city, especially when Georgina Cleage and Chris Gannon were talking about moving through a city as a blind person and kind of the narrative that they build around that experience. I actually had not ever looked up the root of the word narration, which I thought would have something to do with telling or speaking. But it's not actually. It comes from narration comes from the Latin word naris with a G in front, G-N-A-R-U-S, which is akin to gnocere, again the G-N-O-S-C-E-R-E, as in gnostic or agnostic. So this word is about knowing. It's not really about telling. And that was interesting to me. And so I thought, well, how about story? Is story about telling? But there too, story has the same roots as the word history, and the Greek is istor, which is knowing or inquiry. And so I think this is interesting as we listen to Sue and Anisha talk about their project, and it also sheds light, I think, on my project on the Albany Vault, which is also about collecting stories. Because the collection of those stories is part of how we know a place and not just how we represent it. So that's an interesting question to me. But I was still looking for a word that is about telling stories. So I looked up tell. And that's from the Old English tellan, which is akin to the Old High German zählen, to count. And so counting is part of what Greg Niemeyer and Ron Rael were talking about. They're knowing a city by counting in order that they can tell a story about the city that will hopefully give San Leandro information they need to make decisions. And when we think of other words for story, an account of an event, an account of a place, obviously comes from a word about counting. So I think as we listen to Sue and Anisha, it'll be interesting to think about what does the telling of stories and the counting of people have to do with knowing, the generation of knowledge. So Anisha is a master's student in city planning and architecture. She has a background in community development and communications. She's currently engaged in two projects: an ethnographic research project documenting demographic and land use change in Silicon Valley, and secondly, a critical design research initiative interrogating media representations of architecture and urbanism. She is currently acting as a consultant for Communities Crossing, which is the project we're going to talk about. And Sue Mark has a BA in philosophy and linguistics and an MFA from the California College of Arts. She creates national and international performance-based projects exploring the intersections of lost history and cultural complexities. With the marksearch team, collaborating with Bruce Douglas, she situates cross-disciplinary work along the evolving continuum of social practice art by creating sculptural structures for improvisational collaboration in public spaces. So we've heard Shannon Steen talking about gentrification from one point of view, one approach, and we're going to see a different approach to looking at some similar issues today. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Can we turn off some of the names? Well, I just want to thank Susan for developing this amazing series. I've been to a couple of the sessions, and it's just been so interesting to hear the different perspectives, and it's really an honor to be here to share information with you about the project that I'm working on. And I usually describe myself as a cultural researcher, and I work in an interdisciplinary way using strategies from history, anthropology, and cultural landscape studies to develop an art project. Most of my work exists in a community, explorations about how people understand the places that they live in. In 2013, I was invited by the Global Art Institute, which is a printmaking center based in Berkeley, to work on their new venture. It's a creative placemaking project called Print Public, their effort to bring print media out into the surrounding community. They're on San Pablo Avenue, near where Berkeley, Emeryville, and Oakland come together. I don't have a printmaking background, but Kala asked me to join this effort because of my experience in building coalitions and collaborations with groups in a particular place. And that's really a vital part of my working process. It all takes a lot of time. This is a multi-phase project, Communities Crossing, and it will end in late 2015. So today we'll be showing you some images from the project's development, and the text on the images are all drawn from conversations that I've had with people in the neighborhood.
And I think of myself as an urbanist. I have a planning degree and I'm doing graduate work in design research, primarily trying to understand the social dimensions of the built environment. I'm interested in how knowledge is being produced about the city, and in particular, how difference in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, able-bodiedness, language, religion, and other dimensions of difference, how that's being understood and managed in a city. I also work in an interdisciplinary way using history and anthropology, and Sue and I came together because we realized that our questions and our methods were very similar, but that our interventions were very different in scope. And so with this project in particular, Communities Crossing, I'm assisting Sue with the project and really trying to learn a lot from her and her method, and we're not really sure what our collaboration will yield just yet.
So the start of a project for me always involves different levels of research. And the very first thing I did was in this neighborhood, spend time walking around the area, riding my bike, taking photos, and observing the streetscapes. There's a lot of architectural variation. It's a very old neighborhood with many historic homes, but it's also a rapidly changing area with a lot of condo development. And I was curious also to see how the borders of the city were marked. Most of the time there weren't any official signs, and you could only tell you were in a different city by the color of the street signs. I also started reading online information. I was looking for anything about community groups, small businesses, blog articles about the area. And as it turned out, in 2012, there was kind of an explosion of comments, articles, and blog postings about something called NOBI, North Oakland, Berkeley, Emeryville. This realtor-inspired rebranding of these neighborhoods was not happily accepted by the longtime residents. And I just want to say that this is a narrow street that dates back to the mid-1800s, and it was a main thoroughfare passageway from San Pablo Avenue to the bay. And there usually are not that many people on there. This was part of a walking tour that I helped shape.
So in terms of thinking about the strategies of creative placemaking, and this is especially true for those of us trained as planners and designers, I really think we can't just go in and try to figure out what the problems are spatially or socially and apply our expertise to fix them, and voila, all of a sudden the residents all have a deep sense of place and you can feel really good about yourself. It's really more about just taking a step back from wanting to frame a problem in the first place and really just being present and learning to see the place and the people first. So inherent in this approach are two main questions. One, what is expertise? What are the assumptions embedded in one's field of expertise? And how are these embedded assumptions shaping what we see or what we think we know about a place? And secondly, when and how do you know that what you think you know is actually accurate? But really the idea behind all of that is that knowing a place takes time. It's messy, it's highly nonlinear, it's idiosyncratic and unpredictable. And yet societal institutions, whether that's CALA, UC Berkeley, the City of Oakland's planning department, an architecture firm, or philanthropic organizations like the Ford Foundation, All of these institutions work with expectations of progress, timelines, deliverables, efficiency, results, funding cycles, etc., which really just don't play out in the real world. So when one does this kind of neighborhood work, this discrepancy is something you learn to live with. But at the end of the day, if you really want to affect real change in a neighborhood, the logic of that place has to rule your work, not the logic of the institution through which you may find yourself there.
So during my online research, I came across an article on a local news blog about somebody named Charles Klinkner, a flamboyant entrepreneur in the area, larger-than-life con man or genius, depending on your point of view, who purchased some land in the area in the 1870s. I met with a local historian, one of the several people who started the Emeryville Historical Society, to talk about Klinkner. This historian has a robust collection of material about Klinkner, and one of their newsletters published in the early 90s was about this maverick developer whose personality and advertising antics played a big role in the area's growth. The Emeryville Historical Society was formed in the 1980s in response to both development in Emeryville and a growing interest in the area's early history. The small group, consisting of a few active members, publishes extremely well-researched, hyper-local quarterly newsletters. Unfortunately, very few of their newsletters are available online. And over the years, they've also amassed a highly detailed collection of historical material. As I've been working with their materials, I've been wondering who accesses the material. Sure, people like me who have creative obsessions with history, yeah, I can have access to it, but the general public doesn't. And I've also spent hours in the Oakland History Room, which is part of the Oakland Public Library. It's their archive. I've spent time in other archives, online archives. So there's a lot of information around, but most people from the neighborhood won't be engaging in this level of research. So how can they know about the journals from the Emeryville Historical Society? And how can they know about some of the other history available in other archives? To respond to these questions, I've been developing a series of interactive neighborhood-based interventions that form my arc: a neighborhood meeting, a walking tour, an installation in the local library, and in the future, a series of on-the-street improv performances. And these interventions don't really look like art that you would find in a museum or a gallery, but it's a way to encounter people where they already are. And now I'm in conversation with local residents and neighborhood activists about ways to be strategic in these efforts. How can I build on existing actions? And who will be a permanent steward of all of this information that I've encountered?
So another creative placemaking method is archival research, which brings up many other questions regarding accessibility, expertise, and professionalism. There are a lot of affective, emotional, physical, material, and experiential aspects of this mixed methods approach to understanding neighborhoods and coming up with creative interventions. These aspects highlight many contradictions about who is called a historian and an archivist, or what counts as archives. Often the richest source materials about a place are webs of people who've lived or worked in a place and gotten connected to each other over time. So meeting one key person can bring you into this world of connected, collective knowledge. In essence, people too are archives of memories, incidents, stories, and experiences. They may have pictures in their home, ephemera from an important event, and of course they will have lots and lots of stories. But these networks of living archives aren't an officially recognized place with the resources to preserve materials in temperature-controlled environments and on acid-free paper, etc. There is a formality to archives with a capital A, but these human networks of archival information are informal, yet there are rules and conventions with each. Whereas the archives with a capital A might be spaces with posted lists of rules, the rules of human networks have to be learned through experience. So in having recognized these blurry distinctions between amateur historians and officially recognized history rooms, Sue and I, as we collect and reinterpret historical material, are really seeing our biggest challenge as figuring out where all of our efforts will go, Who will be able to access it? Is it a digital space like a website? Will it be a room or a physical space, a performance? And how can all of our work strengthen these networks of living archives that already exist in the neighborhood?
I attended many community meetings and events, and I tried to engage with local knowledge bearers so that I could gain insider information. And I've gathered from these meetings community asset maps and research done by UC Berkeley students and students from other colleges, and more information about local issues. As I develop any project, and this project in particular, it's vital that the community members see me repeatedly in community-based contexts. To reach a meaningful depth, I need to build trust with individuals. This is the only way that I know to develop an authentic project that has the potential for longevity within the community, especially with work that has non-permanent components like what I do. It's essential that the project has some way of living on after my direct work is done. Maybe there's a spark, an idea, a connection among people that will remain. For this project, one of my current goals is to meet with a range of residents and talk to them about their experiences in the neighborhood. To do this, I need to know people, and to get to know people, building their trust is paramount. I'm entering an intimate space. Neighbors live together. Even though I'm pretty local to this area, I live in North Oakland, I'm still an outsider. It was only after seeing me at 4 different meetings and events that a longtime community member and activist shared information with me about people to contact for interviews, and that was golden. You can't get that by putting out a call in a neighborhood listserv or talking to strangers on the street corner. And what I'm trying to understand now are some deeper questions about the relationships of informal and grassroots groups with municipal leaders. Who can leverage change and in what ways?
So this brings us to another disjuncture in doing neighborhood level research, the gap between systems of governance and authority and informal collectives who see a need and address it. For example, this photo is important because this intersection, 55th and Market in North Oakland, got a stoplight only because of Black Panther community action that demanded that the city put one in at this high traffic intersection. So the interface between the city, planners, designers, institutions, and other professional mechanisms and technologies that come together to manage the city and local community groups, this is highly uneven and without logic. Again, there's a formality to governance structures and technologies of management, which runs counter to the informality of community groups. And again, there is a logic to both sides, and it requires experience over time to understand both sets of logics. In terms of our methodology and our collaboration, this gap isn't central to how we work, but it is an important aspect of what shapes the neighborhood's experience. And so indirectly, this is very central to what we're doing. The human networks of information that we just mentioned, very often these are the very same people that are engaged in collective efforts to address neighborhood issues. So we have to always be cognizant of their agenda as we're interacting with them. Moreover, being in the unique position that we are in, do we have a responsibility to address their neighborhood agendas and needs through our work? In other words, where does the artwork fit in amidst this disjuncture of governance structures and community organized action?
An ongoing process for me in this project is developing my understanding of the different elements of change that have impacted the neighborhood over, say, the last 100 years, as well as the last 4 or 5 years. It's hard to approach the topic of gentrification because it's so loaded and hot. One person I spoke with in the neighborhood said that there are usually only 2 sides to gentrification. Either you're the perpetrator or you're the victim, and there's no middle ground. In this community, all you have to do is say the word "no-be," and you can already feel a charge in the air. And this is a quote, a passage from a blog magazine that was published in 2012. If you live in Oakland or are looking to buy or rent a place, you might have noticed a new neighborhood name has arisen in the last year. NOBE. What the hell is NOBE, you ask? It stands for North Oakland, Berkeley, Emeryville, and is the name that realtors have been using to attract young urban professionals to a once blighted swath of North Oakland. And I would say that a lot of people would, they would have a problem just with the way that description was written, because I don't think that the residents there call their neighborhood a once blighted swath. So, already there's just a really difficult dynamic. When Novi first emerged in 2012, realtors put out a promotional video which prompted very strong reactions in the neighborhood, produced counter video, and many, many long meetings that some people attended and many didn't. What I want to do with this project, with Communities Crossing, is to offer various non-charged platforms to explore the issue of change and to meet people where they already are.
Sue and I have talked a lot about the very charged atmosphere in the Bay Area. So Sue and I have talked a lot about the very charged atmosphere in the Bay Area and the many complicated issues that have come up in the past 2 to 3 years. Everything from tech buses using public bus stops and how these routes then are directly linked to rent prices going up in the surrounding neighborhoods, to the very recent controversy over Mission Playground in San Francisco and that video that went viral. And we're really of the opinion that these charged incidents, while being very eye-opening and very important, they actually aren't really productive. They shut people down, they make what is actually a very intensely complicated process into a two-sided ideological debate, and in the end, they don't actually stop gentrification. So Sue said she wanted our work to build a third way of talking about the issue of gentrification, and even just using the words neighborhood change instead of gentrification is a useful first step. That said, Sue and I have also talked a lot about the fact that incivility about injustice is very important. If it wasn't for those kids speaking up and the videotaping of that playground incident, nobody would know about this small yet huge injustice that's been going on for over a year. So while we acknowledge that we can't shy away from calling out a wrong because we may be afraid of confrontation, we have to create more pathways for a more productive dialogue that at least reveals more of the complexity of gentrification and neighborhood change.
The local library seemed like a natural hub to me. It's on San Pablo Avenue in North Oakland's Golden Gate neighborhood. But it also serves Berkeley and Emeryville, and more than 2,000 people visit this library every week. Early on in the project, I approached the library manager about hosting aspects of the project at the library. I decided to make bookmarks that revealed bits of information about this guy, Klinkner, the area's first and most dramatic real estate developer. He used painted donkeys, huge banners, and a crew of suited monkeys to advertise 50 houses on 14 acres that were eventually annexed to Oakland in 1890. Maybe you could even call him the very first gentrifier of the area. But how could I invite people to engage with history, with more information about this time period, and how might history reflect on current transitions in the neighborhood? So I developed 6 different designs using archival material for these bookmarks. Newspaper articles, headlines from the late 1800s, photos, and even a promotional postcard for the town of Klinknerville. I translated some of Klinkner's antics into symbolic drawings and overlaid them on the historic material. And then I hand-printed 2,000 bookmarks, and they're randomly interleaved into the library's shelved collection so that anybody who checks out a book might find one of these bookmarks. Another great local resource that may be underknown is the Oakland Wiki, which is an open source site about all kinds of Oakland information. There's a dedicated group that started this site, and many of them are archivists and librarians. They want to provide people with a malleable portal to Oakland's history. So my bookmark links to the wiki, and through this project I hope to link more materials that I've used to the Oakland Wiki. Though the web is this flexible and massive container, I'm not yet clear on the most effective way to share these materials, as raw information, as a summary of content, as part of an existing archive, on a dedicated project site, or maybe even on a neighborhood site.
So in the process of creating one small intervention, after Sue had made these bookmarks, I came on board and created an infogram, a one-pager about the project with just some condensed historical information. One of the things that came up for us as we did this, and as we think of future interventions going forward, is that the end product always has to reflect the integrated nature of our process. That this is all about embedding ourselves in the neighborhood and embedding the projects within a pre-existing social fabric, rather than imposing ourselves and our project on the neighborhood. And one small experience that really made this clear came up in creating a map of the neighborhood. And we asked, what are the boundaries of this neighborhood? And we realized that no answer is ever complete. Boundaries are inherently always blurry and inexact, especially with neighborhoods. And so we asked a number of community leaders and went back to scour the Historical Society's newsletters, and we looked at old photos of Klinknerville, and in the end we took a guess based on these resources. And so that's sort of what we mean about integrated process, that when the community sees this map, it resonates with their sensibilities of their neighborhood. But this experience also brought up, especially for me because I made the map, I worry that because this infogram is laminated and being circulated at the library, that now there's some sort of, it seems official, it has a finality and a formality to it, when in fact, actually this question of neighborhood boundaries is still an open question. And so this approach of creative placemaking is one of being critically engaged and always questioning the reception and consequences of one's interventions.
Building on all of these steps, in July of 2014, I worked with people in the community to develop a walking discussion. I had originally proposed a panel discussion in the library, but it felt wrong to talk about neighborhood assets and change in a darkened room. Better to directly explore aspects of the neighborhood in real time and have people with experience talk about these places. Because I had been networking with community activists, they helped to schedule this discussion during an ambitious multi-city event called Love Our Neighborhood Day. Oakland and Emeryville hosed off neighborhood streets, including a stretch of San Pablo Avenue, for a day of riding, walking, and getting to know neighbors. And for the walking discussion, we had over 75 people participate. And now I'm meeting individually with neighbors, new residents, as well as people who've been in the community for several decades to understand their experience of local change. These recorded conversations will form the basis for a series of improvisational, interactive, on-the-street performances in the spring and summer of 2015. Improv dancers will engage with neighbors at bus stops, parks, farmers markets, and other strategic locations. And I'll be designing large digitally printed wearable banners that the dancers will use to springboard improvisational movements and discussions about change.
So Sue just casually coined this phrase about that experience, but I really think it says it all. She said it's a walking discussion, not a panel discussion. So it's not about cloistered meetings in institutional spaces, which is not to downplay the importance of panel discussions, but rather that when one does neighborhood research, one really has to engage the site in real time. And so following this, as we are in the middle of our work, the big question for us is, what is the lasting impact of this third way?
And I also want to invite you all to take a card. I put some out on the table. And next week, next Thursday, the 13th, from 6 to 8, there'll be some presentations at the Kala Art Institute. There are 6 artist teams that are working in projects in this neighborhood, all different kinds of creative placemaking efforts. So if you have time and you're interested in learning more, I welcome you to take a card. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue and Anisha. That was so interesting. I want to, just before it slips my mind, to mention that your description of your research using the hyperlocal publication is very similar to what our next speaker, Jordan Sand, did in Tokyo. And I think you would be interested, but I think everybody might be interested, in his book called Tokyo Vernacular. He looked at the way a neighborhood chronicled itself, this very dense, intricate working class neighborhood going through a period of accelerated change in the 1980s. And he painted a really wonderful portrait as a professional historian, kind of raising the issue of who gets to do this. And he told the story of this Tokyo neighborhood in that way. And I also recommend for folks who are particularly interested in that talk 2 weeks from now, the book Tokyo Vernacular also has a very interesting section on the student occupation of the West Shinjuku station in 1969. It's a terrific book if you're interested in cities. So I want to give everyone a chance to ask questions, but I want to start with a question about what Anisha mentioned about schedules, the imposition of institutional necessity on a process, because as both a city planner myself and as a citizen who's been to way more public meetings and charrettes and community meetings than I care to describe, your approach and the gentleness of it and the patience embodied in it is really interesting. And the way that you literally embed yourself gently in a neighborhood between the leaves of a book, that process of discovery and of building knowledge in that gentle kind of walking pace is really wonderful. But I would like to ask Anisha about a statement that you made, and the way you worded it, I wrote it down, because you said, in criticizing our usual approach to planning processes, you said, the logic of a place has to rule our work, not the logic of institutions. And what's interesting to me in that sentence is has to, because actually I think what you mean is should, because the has to consists of the processes that are legally required. And for folks who are not planners, I know there are people from many departments here, how decisions are made in a neighborhood about whether a building gets built, about whether a stop sign is put in. It's ruled by many, many laws and regulations. For example, the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. There are deadlines. And so if you object to something in the neighborhood and within the CEQA comment period, you don't come to the city council or write a letter and voice your objection, you can't bring a lawsuit later. So there are a lot of has-tos that make it difficult to carry out this kind of gentle listening that is ideal in helping us think about understanding cities and then taking action. And that's one of the main themes of this course, is what's the connection between interpretation and intervention. And here at Worcester Hall, where we're designers and planners, we are always thinking about intervention and about problem solving. And some folks who are from humanities departments may not always have that imperative. You may have more leisure or more time, and I think perhaps better skills also at just looking and listening. So I'm really interested, and again, in a formal planning process about a neighborhood, the outcome of, say, an official meeting is to have a vote, or if it's a community meeting, to come away with some kind of summary of this. These are the priorities of the people, and they voted with their little green dots, and this is what they think is important. Do you care about whether your techniques could actually be used within the legal and regulatory framework in which we have to operate? Or is it just fine that you're helping understanding and maybe it actually won't affect outcomes?
That's a really interesting point, and I think you're right. The phrasing of has to, you're right, there are legal implications to how a place has to be constructed that interfere with this kind of process. I guess I meant more just for people in our position who have the opportunity to be these liaisons between the logics of communities and the logics of institutions. I guess I'm taking that position that we should prioritize the logic of the community, because so often the logic of the institution does take over. And I do agree that in the end there are a lot of legal obligations that do rule the day. But I think as much as we can in our gentle approach, if we can try to always prioritize the logic of the community, as long as it's not, dramatically interfering with the logic of that institution or some legal ramification. Yeah, I think it is something that as artists and practitioners who are doing research and maybe not necessarily the ultimate, the ultimate decision makers, that at least in our work, we can prioritize the logic of the community. I don't know if that answers the question.
Would your response be different from Anisha's trained as a
Well,
planner?
we were just talking about something similar before we were giving this presentation, just in terms of, for me, it's been a real interesting process being kind of an in-between. I often do work with different city organizations or departments, and with people on the ground, and I can work in a way that's totally different than the way a city would operate, because I generally don't call meetings and ask people to come. I go out on the street and I do things so that I can meet a wide range of people, because it's, usually a certain type of folk who will come to a meeting, but there are a lot of people in the neighborhood who have opinions, and so being able to operate in between, and I'm not a representative of the city, but people in the city will listen to what I have to say, and people in the community, after a while, they see me around, they trust me, and so they'll tell me things. But I think it's really the question of, where is the power to affect change, right? And so I think that's always kind of the point that I'm left with in doing this kind of work, that it is empowering to people in the community when I'm there doing a project, because there's momentum, I have funding, I do have a time frame. My projects have to end at a certain point because the grant runs out or the project, schedule is done, but the work is limitless. And so really what I'm trying to think about now is, how can I really connect in a deeper way with people in the community so that some of the momentum that I've started, they can continue in whatever way that they want to. And maybe it is just seeing that there are other approaches aside from, like, oh, the city council person is not responding to our emails. So what's another way around that?
Great. I'm going to make one small comment and then open it up to questions. And the other thing that really struck me when you described basically a city council meeting or a public meeting as cloistered, which is really interesting because that's kind of flipping the public and private, which is also kind of what we were talking about at the Albany Bulb, that what some people called privatization, the use of the land by homeless people for encampments. Other people thought that was a good public use. So what is public and what is private? Again, it's legally defined. So a meeting in a room with a bunch of people who come, or the people who have time to come to public meetings, that's considered a public meeting. And if you put a piece of paper up at the library and announce it, then that's considered public, public process, it's public. Whereas walking down the street, unless it's announced on that piece of paper in a certain specific legal way, that's not a public meeting. And similarly, if there are discussions going on among city council members online, like comments back and forth in a newspaper response or anything online, that is considered illegally private. So city council members, there's something called the Brown Act, you're supposed to discuss matters in public. And so they're above a certain number of city council members are not allowed to discuss public business unless they're doing it in public there. But our current laws say that the public place is that cloistered room or that room. Whereas if you do it online, which really in effect is more public, that's considered private and it's illegal. So I think the definitions of space and public and private space and virtual space and physical space are very complicated. So I will let folks ask their own questions now. Go ahead.
I have a question that's probably a little bit more for Anisha, but maybe both have thoughts on this. Around the idea of mapping the neighborhood and representing it, I think it was really interesting to hear some of the debates around kind of realtors inventing a term and forcing it on a community. And I'm curious what sort of sources and methodology guided your own mappings of the project. Were there particular sources that seemed more authentic or more trustworthy than realtors? And then also just around naming, did you end up with a name for the neighborhood? Is it Golden Gate? Is it something that we don't know about because it's a local knowledge? I'm just really curious in that process.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wonder if Sue should take the first stab at that, because I think a lot of the competition.
Well, yeah, so I had asked Anisha if she could make this infogram. We were talking talking about the components. And so first we looked at the Oakland Wiki, which has all these different neighborhood maps layered one on top of the other. And Anisha had taken the neighborhood map that was listed for Golden Gate. And I looked at it and was like, wait, that doesn't quite look right. And so I put it out to a bunch of people that I met in the neighborhood, as well as people connected with the Oakland Wiki to find out, well, how come that looks funny? It looks strange. And so then somebody from the wiki said, well, you know, you probably should look at the Spigia neighborhood map, which is the neighborhood group for the Golden Gate area. And that map is actually different than the Golden Gate map. And then, you know, in talking to people, so the picture where somebody's hand is on the map, she was looking at it, she's like, oh, actually I think that it's not including this other small piece over here that should be part of the Golden Gate. So we talked to people, you know, through email, you know, people that I had met to try and get at the, like a good, safe, educated guess. And the same thing happened with the trying to find the map of Clinkerville. And there's a lot of discrepancy about, you know, how many houses did he build and exactly where do the boundaries of his tract stop and start as opposed to other people. And so there's a whole lot more research that could be done just on this one small piece of the puzzle. And one of the planners from the city of Oakland, who's also, she's kind of in charge of all the historic homes and information, said, well, the best way to find out the boundaries of Clinkerville is to get all the mail that was delivered to the houses in Clinkerville, but that's impossible because we don't have that mail. So basically, we can never really know. And so, you know, based on some information that I had in talking to people and my looking around in places, we kind of made this best guess scenario. And wanted to have something concrete at the library because the bookmarks that I made are symbolic and a little bit cryptic, and other people might want to really know more about dates and places. And I didn't want to overburden the librarians with them having to answer a lot of questions they didn't know. So they put this information up prominently in the library. It had been up for several months, and I've not heard anything. You know, my contact information is on it. I haven't heard anything from anybody saying, now wait a minute, this street should be on there. So it's, you know, this has come up in other projects that I've done, and it's, there are a lot of different ways of determining the boundaries of a neighborhood, and I think it's very hard to get consensus. And it, you know, the other thing that I'm really exploring in this project is how neighbors together build a sense of neighborhood, and it really happens block by block. And once you start getting out of, you know, somebody's very local range, it's harder and harder to define boundaries because they don't think that way necessarily.
The question over there.
Well, I happen to live at dead center in that neighborhood, and I teach urban planning. And last night we were at Merritt College. Last night we hosted a meeting in the neighborhood and had to deal with exactly what you're talking about. He was delighted to hear the conversation. And then I had a map up, and I wanted people to put their, you know, where they were and so on. And what I realized is that the boundaries are irrelevant. The center of it is, you know, that it is there is kind of important, and the fact that actually, which is one of the things that Sue works on, doesn't really have a center. But that it's the specific projects that you were talking about, bringing up the legal aspects, is that when you have a specific project, at that point you can define some kind of boundaries that are related to the laws related, or funding or whatever related to that project. And so otherwise, it's best to just leave it diffuse, because you wouldn't want to put a line down and then have arbitrarily, and then have the people on the opposite side of the street say, well, I'm part of that neighborhood, you know, and feel left out.
I'm wondering, you use this term logic of the community. How do you define that term?
Yeah, I mean, I think that So that's what takes time, right? Like it's a very contextual, messy process. It's very nonlinear. I guess what I, like in general, what I meant when I was trying to put a phrase to what we're trying to do, I guess I just meant that different communities of people that live in a place have different agendas that are happening at different time scales, and just getting a sense of who in the neighborhood is salient in what way and what's important to them, and what has had significance over time, or historically been significant as an event or as a process to that neighborhood. Those are all, I think, logics of that neighborhood or that community. But I think at the heart of it, it's more about like what is really important to the different agendas and stakeholders in that community. But it is a very nebulous concept. I mean, I was just trying to come up with a phrase that would juxtapose this sort of neat formality of legal regulations or planning processes in a very as a city planning operation, and the opposite of that is something very diffuse and not something that you can actually draw a neat box around.
Yeah.
But that is a good question.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the same thing a lot. I think maybe it's something that's the opposite of a logic, because a logic is, I think communities are basically
came up
illogical.
with that because we have a lot of long conversations about, what's happening on the street or what I'm encountering, and most of our conversations end up being digressions of very, very detailed stories that people tell me, and they don't always match up, but there's some overlap. And as I'm interviewing people, that's what we're going to try and see is where is there overlap and where is there digression in the kinds of stories that people are telling.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing the stories of your stories.